All right. So tonight I'm going to be talking about my process of porting the scanner module from the 777.
Hey, Christian, your mic is really low. I don't know if it's going to get recorded at the right level. Barely hear you.
Is this better?
That was a little better, yeah.
Okay, maybe I have to stand closer to the mic.
You want headset?
Yeah, it's back to low again.
Yeah, because he moved away from the. You want that headset? You got it.
I don't think I can do one or the other. Resume recording now. Okay, so I guess I'll just start over real quick. So tonight I'm going to be talking about the process of porting the Drupal scanner module from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. So I'll just start with a real quick introduction. My name is Christian Crawford. I am located up in Jacksonville, Florida. I went to UNF and graduated with a CS degree in 2015. As far as my Drupal experience goes, I basically started using Drupal around 2014. And then since then, I've basically been working on Drupal 6 a little bit, but mostly Drupal 7. And then the past couple of years, I've been doing Drupal 8 work. So my primary work is basically Drupal, so PHP, that kind of thing. But I'm also involved with some of the front-end stuff, so like Angular, AngularJS, or React.js, or jQuery, or even just basic HTML, CSS kind of stuff. You may have seen me at the Florida Drupal camp. I've been the past 3 years, and 2 years ago, I gave a presentation along with one of my other colleagues. So yeah, that's me. Also, I work at Spinspire. I have a logo down there. So you may be asking, what is the scanner module? Basically, the scanner module is basically a search and replace for your site's content. Over here, you can see a screenshot of what the Drupal 7 interface looks like. You basically have an input field for the search term, an input field for the replace term. And then inside there, there's a couple different what they call search options, which basically allow you to filter down the results. So there's options for case sensitivity, there's options for word bounded or whole word matching. There's an option for, instead of just plain text, there's regular expression search term options. Then there's also the ability to only search for published nodes. And then finally, there's this option for maintaining custom aliases, but I won't really touch on that much in this presentation. So along with this interface, there is an admin form. And on that form, you're basically allowed to set the default values for these options down here, the search and the various sensitivities and word bounded and stuff. And also you can set up which fields that you want the module to look through. In the case of the Drupal 7 version of the module, because of how Drupal was, mostly you would only use node entities. So the Drupal 7 version of the module only works on node entities, doesn't work on any other entities. As I mentioned, this module has been around for a while. It was originally developed back in Drupal 5 days, so they've been through a couple of maintainers over the years. And as far as another functionality of the module is, so it can do, obviously it can do the search and replace, but then it can also undo those replacement operations. And that's all achieved through the Drupal's revision system. So when you perform a search, you basically, again, you enter the search term, you hit the search button in the case if you want to search for something. And then down below this little search options, there'll be a tabulated list of all the entities that match, that have a matching word in the fields, as well as a link to that entity and a short like snippet of the body or whatever field that particular search term is located in. Yeah. All right, so now on to why did I actually end up porting this module from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8? Well, it turns out that when I went to look for a module that does this capability, there weren't any modules that existed in the Drupal 8 space, at least none that did exactly or everything that I needed it to do. What I did find was there is some Drush script that claims to be able to do that, but since it doesn't have a user interface, that wouldn't really work for my use case where I needed the editors to be able to do the search and replace operation from the browser side. So that I didn't really look too far into that. So I don't know if it really actually works, but that was one thing that I did run across. So also, along with not being able to find a module, I also want to just increase and grow my Drupal knowledge. So I figured it would probably be a good opportunity to learn a whole lot of about all the new stuff that's available in Drupal 8, increase my knowledge. You see down here, this is basically a screenshot of the issue queue of the scanner module. If you look at the top there, you'll see that there is actually an issue which was created about, at least as of today, it was created about 1 year and 4 months ago to port this module to Drupal 8. But when I first looked into this, there wasn't really anybody that had done a whole lot of work. So where to begin? Basically, as I showed in the last slide, the first thing that I did after I decided that I was going to use the scanner module was to look at the module's issue queue. So to see in case anybody had already done the work for me, so then I could just use their work instead of having to go through the whole process of rewriting the module myself and getting it all up to snuff for Drupal 8. As I mentioned, there was one issue ticket, whatever you want to call it, in the system. And this one user down there, Shreya, she had done a basically a very basic port of the module. It did, as she describes, basically it does the basic configuration of the module and the basic search for node entities only. But as I said, I needed the module to do a lot more than that. So I obviously needed it to search as well as replace. But then I also, the site that I was going to deploy this module in uses extensively the paragraphs module and several other entities. So I needed to be able to also search through those other entities. So that was another reason for me to actually go through the process of rewriting the module itself. So once I found the module, or her patch rather, I downloaded that and applied it to the existing Drupal 7 code base and tried it out. And sure enough, it did in fact do exactly what she said. It worked through all the nodes. It would display the results. But again, the replacement functionality wasn't there. And the displaying of the results wasn't all that great. And of course, it only worked on nodes, which was a big deal breaker for me. So after I went through her patch, I looked, basically kind of like skimmed through the existing Drupal 7 code base so I could get an idea of what functionality the module provides other than what you can obviously see from just interacting from the browser, as well as basically how they achieved those particular actions of search, replace, undo, that kind of thing. So then after that, basically I decided on what features I needed to be able to use, or what features I needed in this new version of the module in order for me to be able to use it in my specific use case. All right, so some of the goals that I set out to do when I was porting this module was, firstly, was to be a feature parity with the Drupal 7 module. So I basically wanted to, everything that the Drupal 7 module did, I wanted to make sure that that was also available in the Drupal 8 version of the module, which is pretty simple, at least conceptually wise. All it has is the node search, replace, and undo functionality. So I figured that'd be pretty easy, which turns out it's not, but I'll get to that later. The second goal was to be able to handle paragraph entities, because like I said, my site, there's probably around 60 to 70,000 nodes on the site, and there's probably at least a paragraph or two in probably at least half of those. So the site uses a fair amount of paragraphs, so it definitely needed to be able to handle paragraph entities
Wait,
along.
did you say 60 to 70,000 nodes?
Yeah.
And per node, there will be many, many paragraphs.
Yeah, there could be anywhere from 1 to like 10, depending on.
On average, say 5.
Yeah.
We're talking 300,000 paragraph entities.
Yeah.
And whatever field that entails.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess your batch processing?
Yeah. Eventually, I transitioned to batch processing, but yeah.
So did you use batch processing as such, or just command line rush?
Yeah, the batch API.
Batch API. Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So, like I was mentioning, I needed to be able to target paragraph entities, but the site.
You want to repeat our questions.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, the question was basically relating to paragraphs. So how many paragraphs are on the site? There's obviously there's a whole bunch of those. For every node, there could be 5 to 10 paragraph entities. And they also asked about how I was like batching and processing. And I mentioned that I do use the batch API, and there are some slides on that, which I'll get to later. So the next goal, the site is a multilingual site. So I needed to make sure that if I was going to update a node, it was only going to affect the specific language that they wanted to update. So I basically added another option to the form here, which basically has a drop-down, which allows you to select the particular language of whatever language you want to target when you're doing the search and replace. And each of those options will correspond to the languages that you have currently enabled on your Drupal site.
What is that?
But, well, it's not. This is a screenshot of the Drupal 7 module. When you get to the actual demo, you'll see the real one. So I wanted to make sure that I was following the best practices for Drupal and the whole Drupal API and that kind of thing. So for example, in the Drupal 7 module, when they were building like the queries to find the search strings and whatever fields and tables they were in, basically the module creator, I'm not sure if this was just legacy code or whatever, but basically he was building the table names and field names based just by like concatenating strings and stuff. That's probably not the best way, and it's probably error prone, even though the module's been around for, again, probably 5 or 6 years, and it has, today I think it had around 100,000 downloads and about 15,000 sites currently using it. So it's probably stable and works, but I think you should probably use something like the actual Drupal's like entity query API and things like that. So the next goal, so the first 3 goals, basically I had those when I first started porting the module. And the next 4, 5, and 6, I basically came up with as I was developing the module. So initially I ported just the node find, replace, and then undo operations. And then I decided I was going to add the paragraphs functionality. So after a little while of writing all the code, I realized I should probably break these functionalities up into smaller chunks. So that's when I started looking into the plugins API, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then finally, again, I just wanted to increase my Drupal 8 experience and knowledge. So I'll show a real quick demo of this site. Let's see here. Is that? So if you're logged in as the admin or whoever has permissions, it'll be under content, search and replace. And then you can see here, it's very similar to the Drupal 7 interface. We have our search, replace, and the search options. And then here's that content language that I was mentioning. We get the dropdown of the currently enabled languages on the site. So if we go here real quick, Basically, if we look at the content here, I've just generated probably around 1,000 or so articles and basic pages just for demo purposes. Just give some nice dummy content. So if we go here, I know for a fact that this enter DSO word shows up a whole bunch of times. So if we look here, I hit search. It was really quickly, but if you, I'll touch back on it at the end. But that, if you saw that like progress bar kind of thing, this is basically the batch API in progress. So basically, when you search, eventually, once it's done, you'll see here that you get this nice message saying, okay, I found 1,555 instances of that word, and in those, there was 572, across 572 different entities. So down here at the bottom is basically the results. And it basically is grouped by entity type, and then by bundle. So in this case, node, article. And then within each of those, it's grouped by field. So this is the title field. This is the body field. Each one of these obviously is an instance which has the matching word that we were looking for. There's a view link which takes you to just the view of the node. Then there's edit, which is the node edit page, of course. And then this actually shows you the snippet, which has the particular word you're looking for inside of the context of whatever field. So if in this case, like this word showed up twice in this body, so you have 2 matches, and each of these unordered list things is going to be a bullet point for each instance of that word in the node in this case. So there's articles. There's a whole bunch of these. I scroll down far enough. This is basically the results of the search. Yeah. So let me find like so this was basic pages. Again, we have entity type, bundle, and then the fields. And finally down at the very bottom.
What if you had 300,000 of these?
Well, the page would go on a long time.
But isn't this running in batch mode? Batch API, right?
The search is batched. The results are just spit out after it's done all the batching. The batching just keeps adding to the array, and once it's done, it spits it to the screen. And this.
So they replace this search or replace?
This is just search, but similar, yeah. And finally, we have, like I mentioned, I added paragraph functionality, so now we have the paragraph entity. I have a paragraph type called container and simple text. This is the container, which has a single field in it, which is just a title. And the other paragraph type is the simple text, which has both a title and a body. So again, this is basically just a listing of each instance of this particular search term. So we could also make it case sensitive. In this case, it would do case insensitive is the default option. So in this case, we went from 1,500 results to down to 116 results. So the result set obviously a lot smaller this time. Similarly, if we did whole word matching, in this case, it won't matter. But if there was something like that that had like the examples like run versus running, it would find only the word run if you typed in run. And then of course, regular expressions, you just type in. One thing I did encounter with the regular expressions was that the MySQL regular expression syntax was slightly different from the PHP's MySQL or regular expression syntax. So that's something you'll have to test around until you find the right combination. But it's pretty similar, but like certain meta characters I think were not available in MySQL. So that's basically how the module looks like in Drupal 8, at least the searching operations. Okay. So along with Drupal 8 and Symfony came a whole bunch of new concepts that we could learn about, including, for example, plugins. So plugins are basically small, reusable segment of code, basically, that you can reuse in multiple instances. So for example, blocks are probably the most common instance of plugins. But then there's also things like field types, field widgets, field formatters, the image processors. If you've ever written a search API processor, then you'll be familiar with that. So basically, by implementing things as plugins, you're allowed to create like smaller and easier to test code instead of having like monolithic. Like the original module, the original Drupal 7 module is around 1,600 lines of code, which seems pretty big for me. I've never written a module that's that long, but by writing, like example, by breaking things up and writing them in plugins, the module may still be 600 lines in total, but then it doesn't necessarily have to load all those 1,600 lines every time that the module gets invoked like it did in Drupal 7, because the module creators didn't have any like include files to selectively add and remove lines of code as they needed it. Basically, a plugin is composed of, there's 3 base elements in a plugin. You have the plugin type, you have the plugin discovery mechanism, and then you have the factory. The type is just, for example, like a block or a field type or a field widget. Discovery mechanism is basically a way to tell Drupal or Symfony or whatever, okay, hey, I'm a plugin of this type. Use me whenever you're looking for these types of plugins. There's several different types of discovery mechanisms, including annotations, YAML files, and there's 2 other ones that I can't think of. But I think the most common ones as far as plugins go are annotations. And then the factory, of course, basically handles the discovering and the instantiation of these plugins as they're needed.
As you have shown, can you show a little glimpse of plugin code? So it'll be much easier for new people to, like very quick glimpse of.
Yeah, I'll show off real. So this is the Node plugin that I've written. I'll go over the annotation later, but basically this is my annotation. It just has the scanner, which is the name of my plugin, and then has an ID, and then has a type.
So in this process, you created not just a plugin, but a whole new plugin type, right?
Yeah, I had to create a whole new plugin type, yeah.
Right. So,
yeah. I'll get to it after this part, yeah. So basically, a plugin is no different from really any other PHP class. It just has this decorator annotation thing. So you have your class. It can extend whatever class it needs to. In my case, I have like a base class for all entities that it extends, but you don't have to do that. And then inside of the class, obviously, you have whatever methods that you need to call whenever you're doing operations. In my case, I just have the three search, replace, and undo methods. I'll go over these a little later when I get more into the details of the actual plugin manager and all those things. But you can see this is basically what a plugin looks like. So like I said, instead of having all your logic inside of a single controller class, which is how even the person that, what's her name? Shreya person, she had, when she did her initial port of the module, she basically moved all the code from the module file into the controller file. And initially, I did the same thing, because that made sense, and it was obviously a lot easier to put everything inside of the controller that way. But then I realized that as I was adding more and more functionality, it made more sense to actually break it up into smaller chunks, in this case, like plugins. And this also, alongside making it smaller and probably more performant, it also makes testing easier. So to continue on plugins, because this was a whole brand new plugin, I had to also write a new plugin type. And that basically involves writing a couple files which kind of like stitch everything together. So you have a plugin manager, plugin interface, a plugin base, and the discovery mechanism. The plugin manager basically defines how the plugin type is going to be discovered and basically handles the instantiation of that particular plugin. Typically, you're going to be extending, when you write the plugin manager, you're going to be extending Drupal's default plugin manager class. And by doing that, you basically take away a lot of the work that you would have to write, like all the methods yourself. So by extending that particular class, you get a whole bunch of functionality for free, basically, because that class then extends other classes and implements other interfaces. So you don't have to write a whole bunch of code. The plugin interface basically provides like a blueprint or a contract kind of idea of all the methods that your classes can then implement. So obviously the most common example that people always come up with when they talk about interfaces is something like a vehicle. So you have your vehicle, so you have cars and you have trucks and you have Jeeps and you have Hummers and whatnot. So those are all vehicles. So basically you have a kind of like a superclass of an interface called like vehicle. And a vehicle can have like methods like how many honk sound or how many wheels do I have or how many doors do I have. And then each one of those children classes, so a car or an SUV or a truck or a Hummer or whatever, will then implement the interface and then be able to use those methods that the interface defines with the signatures. So let me quickly show you what one of those looks like. This is the plugin manager, which I first mentioned. So as I said, you basically just extend the default plugin manager. And then the only method you have to implement is the constructor method. So underscore construct. You just pass it whatever arguments it would expect. So it's got the namespace, the cache backend, and then the module handler. And then inside of there, you basically call this guy, the parent, the default plugin manager's construct method. And this time you pass it a couple additional arguments. The first of which is this plugin scanner, which is, I can't remember if it's the namespace or just the folder structure of where your plugins reside, but in both cases, it's the same thing. So then you have your same namespaces from the other guy, you have modular handler. And then the fourth argument is the interface, which I'll look at in a second. And the final argument is the discovery mechanism. In this case, it's going to be an annotation plugin, which I briefly showed earlier. And then after that, you just basically, you have your info alter, which basically allows other people to modify your entities if they wanted to. So I think that would be just like hook scanner info alter. They could implement that hook and then change how the caching works or change how something in this plugin itself works if they implemented that hook. And then finally, you just basically set up the cache, what cache to use. In this case, cache backend is just the default one. And scanner is the key of the cache. So then the interface itself is also pretty simple. You just have your interface, which you extend. You don't have to, I guess, but you probably should extend the plugin inspection interface, which basically allows it to kind of like do self-reflection and look at itself and find out its own properties. And then the container plugin interface basically allows the whole Symfony containerization and dependency injection process to work in this particular anybody that implements this interface. So again, we just have our three methods. We have search method, replace method, and then the undo method. Basically, the search and replace both have these fields and values arguments. The field is just the field that you're looking at, the specific field. So for example, title is just title, and body is field body, or any custom field. And then the values argument is basically the form state values of the form that you selected. So like it includes the search term, the replace term, and any of those search options that you selected. So if you look back here. So that include any of these like case sensitivity, whole word boundary, regular expression, those sorts of things. Those are all included in the values array. And then the replace also contains a third argument, which is basically, I won't get into it a whole lot, but basically it contains an array of revision IDs. So we can, as we're changing the values in the node, we can keep track of the revisions and make sure that we don't create unnecessary revisions. And then finally, the undo method just has this data array, which is basically this undo data. So it's just an array which is keyed by entity ID, and then inside there is the old undo revision IDs. So then we can basically back out or undo any changes that we previously had made. So we go back to here. So plugin base is, as the name implies, basically it's like the base class that all your other plugins are going to be extending. It's going to be an abstract class, and any abstract methods of an abstract class, by definition, have to be implemented by anybody who implements, or rather extends that class. So in this case, this is our plugin base. It extends that plugin base and then implements our custom scanner plugin interface. So then we can get the search, replace, and undo methods. We add a couple additional arguments through dependency injection. The first is the temp store, which is, you can kind of think of it like PHP, like the session superglobal in PHP. But in Drupal 8, they discourage you from putting things into the session superglobal. Instead, this is basically, it stores you can store any data, I suppose, inside, and it gets basically stored into the database. In this case, there's two flavors of the temporary storage. The first is the private temporary storage, which is the one that we're using, as I denoted here in this comment. This basically, the data gets associated with a particular user, whereas the other, just non-private or public or whatever it's called, basically that data can be shared with any of the users, not just a specific one. And then the second argument, of course, is the plugin manager that I wrote, the scanner. I call it scanner manager. So that's what our constructor and our create method are doing. We're just injecting those two dependencies. And as I mentioned, each one of these methods is an abstract method. So therefore, anybody that implements or extends this guy has to then implement these methods as well. You could have any number of non-abstract or other abstract methods in this class, but this is the only one. These are the only methods that I needed. But again, you could have written any number of extra other non-abstract methods yourself if you needed them in this plugin base.
Wait, what was that? Was that a trait or?
This is the plugin base. Yeah. And then finally, you have the discovery mechanism. So basically how Drupal knows to look for them and then how to use this particular plugin. So if we go back to here, go up. So this is, annotations are their own types of plugin. So they live, or no, they're not, I'm sorry, it's incorrect. But they live in the SRC and then annotation. So in here, again, this is very simple. You just basically have your class, which extends the annotation, which I'm assuming that's a Symfony thing, but so you just extend this guy. And then you can add any number of public properties that you would want or need in your annotation definition. So in this case, I only needed, the bare minimum that you have to have is this ID, but you could also have, I also decided to put type in here. But you could have any number of these. So if we go back to the example that I was showing before, with the node plugin, we'll just go to the entity actually. So we have our ID, which is unique within the plugin, and it has to be machine name, so underscores all lower cases. And then type, I don't remember if I used this or not, but basically this is, in this case, it's the generic entity. But if we looked at the node plugin, then it would say node. If we looked at the paragraph plugin, then it would say paragraph. And that basically, if we go back to the manager, is where we reference that annotation in our constructor. This guy, we pass that in. So then Drupal becomes aware of our, basically it looks for any plugins that have this annotation, that @scanner sign. As I mentioned initially, when I just ported the node portion of the functionality, I had written everything in a single controller file. But then as I started building more and more functionality, I realized that it would probably make more sense to actually break things out into their own kind of thing and put them into plugins. So as you probably saw, there are, right now at least, there's just plugins for the node entities and paragraphs. But you could write a plugin for a taxonomy term, a user, or any custom, or for that matter, contrib entities that exist in Drupal. Anything that's basically fieldable, you could basically write a plugin for. Okay, so finally, we'll get to the batch API. So batch API has been part of Drupal since Drupal 5, it seems. And according to the article I read, it's basically been pretty much the exact same code kind of thing to achieve the effect since Drupal 5. There are several advantages and benefits to doing batching. When I gave this presentation 2 or 3 months back, I didn't have batching in the module. And in my demo site, which only has a couple hundred nodes, that wasn't a real issue. Like I ran it and I noticed no issues. Like it never timed out or ran out of memory or anything. But then when I went and tested it in a lower environment of the actual site where I was going to use it, with the site that had the 60,000 nodes and the countless paragraphs, then I ran into the PHP errors pretty quickly once I realized it ran out of, mostly as execution time, but theoretically you could also run out of memory as well. So by batching, you can avoid a lot of that stuff. So you can batch up, obviously you can queue up a whole bunch of tasks to be fired in successive order. You can avoid the issues, the PHP execution limitations, so the time limit and the memory limit, because each batch job basically is a new request and it rebootstraps itself. So then you never run into the execution limit in that case. And on top of that, you also, you get this nice user interface that the user can then see, okay, something is actually happening. There is some progress going on. Like this, obviously, if you've ever seen this thing, so like if you've done like configuration imports, or if you've done search API, you index your site, or anything like that, you've probably seen this little nice scroll bar. It goes along and shows you the progress. That's a nice plus. In the case of the batch jobs, generally, you're going to start the batch job in a form, and you're going to do that generally in the submit handler. So if we take a look at the code. So look at this simplest form, which is just the search form. So if we go here, we have our normal get form ID. So this is just the form, extends form base. We have our form ID. We have our build form, which builds that form that we saw here. Basically builds this portion of the form. A bunch of that. And then we have our validation handler, which there's no logic in there, but I could have written stuff. And finally, we have the submit handler. So submit form in this case. So basically, let's see here. So we're getting the values out of the form state. We are storing them in that temporary storage so we can use the values later. We then find out if the user clicked either search or replace. So in the case of search, we go into this half of the if statement. So we basically load all of the fields that the user has chosen to be searched through. One thing I didn't mention before is there's the admin page. So in this search options, there's a link down here. Click that, it basically takes you to the admin form, which is, again, is very similar to the Drupal 7 version, but I added some Ajax stuff, and I added, of course, the ability to, before, I think all of these were bundled together, like the fields and the entity types weren't separate. So that wasn't an option. So if we turn this back on. So this, again, these values that you select here are what we see in the, basically is what we get back from this config. So this fields of selected content type are the fields that we selected, those things that we checked. So in the case of a batch, basically it's composed of, the batch is basically an array composed of several different keys. So firstly, there's a title. If we look back here, the title is this part up here at the top of the page, the scanner search batch. The operations basically is an array, which I'll show in a second. Finished is basically the method that should be called after all the batches is done. And then progress message is basically, if you look down here, it says processed X out of Y, which is exactly what this message is saying. It's got like token substitution, so it'll show that. So doubling back on the operations, this operations is an array. So for every value in that array, a batch job will get created. So if you look up here, we basically loop through the fields that we've selected, or configured rather, on this form. So each one of these will be a key in this loop. So we'll loop through that. So then this takes basically another array. The first argument is the method to call to perform on the batch job. And the second argument is basically the arguments to pass into the batch job itself. So similar, as we saw before, we have the field value, the field itself, and then the filter operations. So case sensitivity, regular expression, those sorts of things. So again, we loop through that, we build the array of operations, we then pass those operations into this batch array. And then finally, to kick off the batch, you basically say batch set, and then you give it that batch array. In this case, after it's done, we set the form state to rebuild to true. So after they have performed the search, whatever options they've picked, so that these two search and replace fields will be still populated, they don't get blanked out, and whatever options you've chosen down here in the search options will also be pre-checked. In the case of the replacement, we still do the batch job, but first we redirect them to a confirmation page, which I'll look at in a second. But basically, we redirect them to this other page, which is they get a confirmation. So if we look, I'll show that real quick. So this is the confirmation page. So this is the replace operation. So we make sure that they confirm that they actually want to do this. So we print out, okay, we've searched for this. We're going to replace it with this. Is that okay? And you either say yes or no. If you cancel, then it goes back to the original search form. But of course, all the values have been blanked out. So if we instead say yes, if we click confirm, then you would see a whole bunch of, they would queue up all the batches, and it would perform the replacement operation, which I'll show shortly. So this batch search, if you remember, was what we passed in here in this operations, this batch search. So in here, you have the two arguments that we passed in, the field and the values, but then there's also a third argument, which is, if you notice, it's got the ampersand, which means it's passed by reference. And this value, this array basically persists across batch jobs and allows you to store data that you would possibly need in a later iteration. You can also use it to, like if you had like a counter or something, or in this case, we put our results into the results array. So this batch, that's what this context is basically. So in the batch search, we use our plugin manager and we create an instance of the scanner entity. The entity is basically the lowest level entity type. That was like the base one that the other plugins extend. So scanner underscore node and scanner underscore paragraph, those both extended that scanner entities base class. So we try to instantiate this plugin. If something went wrong, then we print the error. Otherwise, we then call the search method on that plugin that we instantiated up here. And we pass it in the same values, the fields and the values. And then we should hopefully get back results. And assuming those results are not an empty array, we then store that into this results. So the context array has some predefined keys, one of which is this results key, and another one is message. And there's a third one, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But the results and the message, I think, are the most popular and common ones used. So we basically set this context results, and then I built this like three-tiered hierarchy with entity type, bundle type, and then field name. Because later on in order to achieve this, in order to achieve like the, not foobar, the like listing of like, I don't know what, like content type, or rather entity type, content type, and then fields. I need it to be able to in that like three-tier structure where I know, okay, these are all nodes. Okay, these are all articles that are type node. And these are all values in the title of an article, which is a node. So that's why I do this like three-tiered hierarchy thing. And then I count the number of results and put that in the count index. And I increment that obviously with each iteration of this batch. So this is the number of entities. So if we look up here, which is this number, 1555, no, rather, 572 is this number. And then the second number, this matches, count matches, is this 1555 number. So that's the number of times that that word shows up in all the entities in all the fields. And then this message here is what you see right here, right above the progress bar, the searching through field value. So once the, after you've done all the batches, so basically once it goes through this part, comes back here, then the finished method, so if we go back here, this finished method, so in this case batch finished, basically gets called, and that one has 3 arguments. The first is success, which is just basically a Boolean. If something went wrong, then it's false. If everything went smoothly, then it's a true value. Results is basically context results array. So it takes the results key out of that array and just passes that into the function. And then if any of the jobs, for whatever reason, didn't get processed in time, that's stored in the operations argument. And then I guess you could further perform you could fire up another set of batch jobs, I guess. I'm not really sure. But either way, so if we are successful, we basically build this render array, which is using our custom theme function, in this case, scanner results. And then the data we're going to pass into the template is stored in this array where we have values.
Searching is not done in batch.
Yes, it is.
It is?
Yeah. Yeah, basically this, because remember in the batch, let's see, where is that operations? Yeah, the operations calls batch search, and that calls the search method.
So, and it accumulates the search results where exactly?
in this, so each time it goes through a field, it returns results to this results array. And then we put this in this persistent array, this context results. And again, that context gets persisted across all batch jobs. So we just keep appending to that array.
What is Drupal doing differently? Is it like a serializing, deserializing? Because see what I'm saying, right? This is not, you cannot just put it in memory. You have to put it.
Yes, because it's somewhere, yeah.
Right? Because you're not guaranteed to be on the same HTTP process even. Maybe, or PHP worker if you're using
FPM, yeah.
So where are?
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot of, batch stuff is definitely my least string.
If a batch process is accumulating information in an array, which means batch process is going to do it in bits and pieces, right? A little bit at a time, which means that context, dollar context, has to be transferred from one execution of batch process to another execution. And in order to transfer the value of a variable across thread boundaries, across process boundaries, across whatever boundaries, the only way to do that is to persist it.
It might be like in the session or something.
Very good. Yeah, it must be in the session.
Yeah,
Wait, whose session? Batch API is supposed to run.
Anonymous?
In the user, I mean, isn't the batch API supposed to run outside of anyone's session?
Yeah, it bootstraps itself, so yeah.
Therefore, outside of anyone's session, right?
Yeah. Maybe it uses zero, I don't know.
If you initiate the batch, you start it, but then it runs 50 in your batch, and then I visit the site and it runs another 50 in mine.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question. What is the size of a batch bundle? And how do we define that? Or do we define that at all?
Basically, it's up to you, I think.
We do define it. We do have to define it. You have to say 50 at a time or 100 at a time.
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm sure there must be some default because I never specify one. Like in this, all I say is the operations and finished and what message to show.
Batch set, hello batch. Okay, all right.
I guess
so
theoretically you could put as much as you want as long as you have enough memory or PHP time.
Yeah, execution time and memory and the size of your operation, whatever you're doing.
Yeah, like this one, it probably, well, obviously we saw in this one, the first batch had, let me get rid of the case sensitivity. It had, let's see, hundreds of them, so. It had 461.
461. In one batch.
Yeah.
And then there are more.
Yeah, I mean, each one of these fields is a batch job, so. Yeah, times 2 times whatever, how many entity content types, yeah. Let's see. Okay, so now that we've gone through some of the code and I've showed you the search, let me show you an example of replace. So in this case, we have, if you remember, 1555 and 527. We'll open another tab just so we won't lose that. So we go here, we look for this, we do this. Make sure we have the same options configured, otherwise we'll have a different number. So hit replace. We'll say yes, we want to do that. And you'll see it's 2 out of 6, 6 out of 7, 7 out of 7. So now if we look for, if you remember, we replaced that, what was it? Let's see. Enter Disio, replaced it with RAFBOO. So if we look up RAFBOO this time, we should see the same 1555 and 527. results. So if we see here, same number of results, matching instances of that word, and then same number of entities returned. And similarly, we can go through and look through all the results, but you can take my word for it that if you see here, now this, so if we look at this one, this says Iram Rafbu, this one says Capto Pharaoh Rafbu. If you go back to this one, it was saying the interstitidio, blah, blah, blah. So it did, in fact, replace them. And even in the paragraphs, which I didn't go into, but I'll briefly go into that later, it even replaced like the paragraphs. We go to the bottom here. Same thing, it replaced the values in the paragraphs as well as the nodes. Let's see. Anything else I wanted? Oh yeah, and the final operation in this whole process is the undo. So along with search and replace, there's another sub-tab called undo. If you notice, if you remember that 572, it should show up. Okay, a slightly different number, but we have the date that the operation was performed, the search term, the replacement term, and the number of entities affected by that particular operation. And then finally, there is the undo link, which if you look down, if you look at the URL, basically there is undo and then one and then confirm. Confirm you can ignore, but the one is the important part. This is basically, there is a custom table, which if we look at Drupal Playground, we go to Scanner. So there's a custom table that this module creates called Scanner during the install in the hook install, or rather in the install file. It basically creates this table with this schema. So it's got the like a unique auto-incrementing ID. It's got a serialized data long text value. It's got a Boolean undo or not undone, undone or not undone. It's got the search term, the replace term, the number of entities, and the current time at which it was executed. So if you look here, this number one corresponds to this one in the URL. So if we hit confirm, we should hopefully, after it's done, have reverted all the changes that we made before. So this form basically only shows results which have a value of undone of 0. But since during the undo batch, basically this value gets reset, or gets set to 1. So if we refresh now, it's a 1. So that's why it no longer shows up on this listing. So basically it prevents you from undoing something you've already undone, which you can't do. So then if we go back to here, and then we perform that initial search again, we should have the same 1555 and 527, which is right back to where we started before I performed the replacement operation. Let's see. So here's some things that I learned along the way. The first thing was basically don't reinvent the wheel if you don't have to. So if you're looking for some functionality, somebody has probably already done it. So for example, I went to the scanner modules issue queue and I looked to see if anybody had already ported it. In this case, there was a partial port. So that gave me a good starting point. So I didn't have to completely start from scratch, but I still had to do a fair amount of work. But again, I didn't have to completely restart. So always make sure that somebody hasn't already done what you're trying to do. Secondly, don't be afraid to look for and try other new things. Basically, with Drupal 8, the number of APIs and classes and all those things, basically the number of them exploded massively compared to Drupal 7. So there's lots and lots of things that you're not going to know. Like I've been doing Drupal 7 for, again, probably 4 years. I felt I was pretty confident, like I knew a fair amount of the API, but in Drupal 8, there's so much that you can't really get a total grasp of everything. So don't be afraid to look up new things. Maybe there's a better way of doing these things in Drupal 8. Always ask for feedback from your peers. So as I mentioned, I gave a similar presentation to this back 2 or 3 months ago. And out of that, I basically refactored this module to, the first refactoring was to add the batch API. And then I refactored it a second time, or I guess a third time in this case, to add something else based on the feedback that I got from the people at the meetup. So that probably improved my code a lot. And also, again, just adding the batch alone made the module actually work in the production site. So that's always a good thing. And finally, get in the habit of writing small bits of code and testing often. So basically, I could have written the entire module's functionality in one go and never tested it at all. But then as soon as I started actually testing it, I probably would have run into 100 different bugs and issues that I couldn't necessarily pinpoint, okay, where exactly is the issue coming from? So instead, I wrote the node search functionality, then I wrote the node replace functionality, then I wrote the node undo functionality. And then similarly, I did the same thing for the paragraphs. And after each one of those things, I did a fair amount of testing, not unit testing, but just on personal, like user testing kind of thing. So that saved me a lot of headaches of being able to quickly diagnose, okay, there's an error in my code, there's a typo, my code is poorly written. So I was able to fix that and improve my code significantly, and without having to do a whole lot of backtracking. And then finally, at the bottom here, there's a link to this Git repository, which I've been showing off. This is on our personal GitHub, but anybody who has the URL can access it. It should be pretty close to the actual patch version that I've submitted to the, let's see, to the actual scanner module itself. So if we go look at the issues, let me go to this one. As you can see, there's a couple patches in here. This was when I initially provided the patch 2 months ago, gave some feedback. This guy tested it real quick. He found a bug. I realized I had forgotten to commit something, so I real quickly re-rolled the patch, re-added it. And we've had a little bit of back and forth between the module maintainer and myself. And yeah, the original person that started that started the whole process of porting it, Shreya. But again, we haven't fully done it. And one area that I don't have basically any experience is unit testing. So that's something I didn't write a single unit test for. So that's something that definitely needs to be written probably before it goes to actual release candidate, but I guess that's up to the modules maintainer.
So in this scenario, your unit test would be mostly backend, right? You don't need a front end.
Yeah, and the Drupal 7 module has probably a dozen tests, but you can't necessarily port them directly to Drupal 8. It doesn't necessarily use the same testing framework and whatnot. So again, this Git repository should be pretty close, if not completely identical to the code that you would get by applying my most recent patch. There may have been one tiny addition that I've made, but again, this code is pretty much the exact same code that's going to be in my patch. If you wanted to test it out yourself before it gets released officially. Let's see. Since it's probably, do you have any questions? Because I don't think anybody else on this end has any.
I don't have any questions.
Okay. Let's see. And then finally, here's just some resources that I came across as I was learning how to do all these things, how to write a plugin, what a plugin is, the issue queue itself, and then some more examples of how to write some plugins. Let's see, anything else? Let's real quick. I've written, oops. I've written on our website. I've written a couple articles on this, but the only one that's currently available is kind of like this one, where basically I outlined the things that I learned throughout the whole process. So I'll include a link of that in the
This presentation URL. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Can you post this presentation URL to either meetup.com or to better yet to the spreadsheet to the Slack channel?
Yeah.
You have already done it?
Oh, this thing's going to be recorded and then shipped out. This thing is recorded, rather. So that'll
I
be.
mean, the Google Doc.
Yeah, I'll include that. I'll send it to whoever. Yeah, so that's about it. So stay tuned. Again, I still have some modules that go more in depth into or more articles rather, that go more in depth about the actual code itself. So if you have any questions, they may be answered in that article. Otherwise, just feel free to reach out to me, either on this Slack, or you can email me at christian@spinspire.com. Yeah, I think that's about it.
Thanks.